Hey folks, I'm brownbear. Today I'd like to spend a few minutes discussing Dark Souls' excellent tutorial. It's a really good introductory sequence, and I think it's worth exploring how important it is to the Dark Souls experience. Dark Souls opens with an introductory cutscene explaining the game's backstory. This explanation is about 5 minutes in length, detailed enough to provide enough color, but not so long that the player gets bored. It focuses on elements that engage the player and enhance the gameplay experience. First, it explains what the world is, where it came from, and what's been happening recently. There's an emphasis on characters and story. Environmental details are omitted because the player will end up exploring them anyway. The visuals speak for themselves while the narrator foreshadows many of the game's later events. The connection between images in the introduction and future gameplay builds engagement and allows players to feel a sense of progress. As players progressively recognize different levels and opponents, they feel like they're moving forward and getting closer to the game's resolution. This background on the overall world slowly transitions into contextualizing the player character. Dark Souls made a good decision here to frame the player as a minor character that merely gets caught up in larger events. This enables a player to focus on the here and now rather than feeling overwhelmed by a weighty story. The heavier narrative elements come later, once the player has already made some progress and gotten comfortable in the game world. This reminded me of another game that did this really well, The Elder Scrolls Morrowind. That game started you off as little more than a freed prisoner. It hinted that there was more to it than that given the circumstances of your release, but it did its best to ground you in your current situation so that you could develop freely as a character. The choice in Oblivion to immediately brand the player as a primary hero didn't feel right. It didn't give you time to find your bearings. Both Dark Souls and Morrowind find the right balance in immersing players in a fixed story, while still allowing them to develop ownership in their characters. This makes a lot of practical sense too, since it feels weird for the principal hero to need an explanation of the basic controls. The nature of games means that players need some foundation to begin playing, a basic set of tools to interact with the game world. It makes sense to ground this in a sequence that downplays the story significance of the main character, and allows the player to focus on getting immersed. The first moments of gameplay demonstrate a few different systems: locked doors, on-screen button prompts, and messaging. The choice to use messages was held over from Demon Souls, and it's a great decision. Messages are simple, fixed, and easy to review if a player forgets something. They're also consistent with the game proper. It's noteworthy that nothing in the Asylum is made throwaway for the purposes of a tutorial. Not only does this contribute to player immersion, it's also what enabled the developers to reuse the environment later in the game. The ladder leading up from the start is a great example. During the tutorial, its significance is understated, but you realize its importance after climbing out of the Stray Demon encounter. The tutorial sequence is structured such that players continuously move upward. There's an environmental sense of progress as players ascend from an underground prison to the top of the Asylum. The two boss encounters reflect this. Initially, the player is jumped upon and needs to run away. Once they've completed the tutorial, they approach it from a position of strength. They've climbed to the top, so to speak, and they're ready to fight back. The initial boss encounter is likely the most unfair sequence in the tutorial, but it's also the most important. On a practical level, it's not a fair fight. The meaning of the message on the ground isn't clear, and the player is encouraged to panic by the sudden entrance of the Asylum Demon. Dark Souls marketed itself on its difficulty, so it's likely some players got roped into a near impossible fight and got frustrated. That practical degree of unfairness doesn't mean the sequence itself is unfair. Tutorials don't exist solely to demonstrate basic mechanics. They also need to explain a game's philosophy and encourage players to approach a game in the right way. This encounter teaches patience and careful thinking. It encourages players to look for a proper solution rather than charging in blindly. The implicit lesson is that the game is not hard if you figure out what you need to do. I'd argue that difficulty is players' greatest misunderstanding when it comes to Dark Souls. It's more of an action puzzle game than anything else. Every supposedly challenging situation has some form of hard counter, easily discoverable if you pay attention while exploring the game world. This sequence is designed to teach that idea, and it's one of the reasons I have so much respect for this tutorial. It goes beyond just teaching mechanics. It also teaches an approach that genuinely enhances the player's enjoyment of the overall game. The next sequence has the player collect their starting weapon. Dark Souls made a great decision in placing an archer here, a significant improvement over Demon Souls. Opponents in the Souls series ought to be viewed like pieces on a chessboard. Players consider how an enemy will attack them and devise a plan to counter and beat it. The trouble in an action game is that it's tempting to fall into the trap of focusing on mechanics, parry timings, invincibility frames, and the like. This is more likely if the player feels threatened or if they see an opponent that seems easy to beat up. Both are the case with the starting enemies of Demon Souls. The archer character here is useful because it's more of an abstract obstacle, so it encourages a more tactical response. This strategic thinking contrasts nicely with the next sequence involving Oscar. From my perspective, the boulder trap here is quite difficult to see ahead of time. It does a good job conveying the idea that sometimes unfair things will just inexplicably happen. Whether that's a good or a bad thing is up to you, but sequences like the Anor Londo archers and the Patches encounters indicate to me that trolling was a genuine component of the game's creative direction. It makes sense that this concept is shown to players right from the start, so they don't feel surprised by it later on. The interaction here with Oscar is usually considered to be pretty important. I appreciate the decision to ground some of the key initial items in an NPC interaction. Watching Oscar fade away provides an emotional weight to the player's journey. Speaking personally, I wasn't too affected by this on my first playthrough, because I was still dazed by the boulder trap. Nonetheless, that the sequence works for other people is good enough for me. What's nice about this dialogue is the way it teaches the game's dialogue system. I don't think it's intuitive to repeatedly hit talk until an NPC repeats themselves, but I still like the way this is structured because it slows down the conversation and builds the right mood. Players are likely to stick around after Oscar's initial dialogue because it ends somewhat ambiguously. This means they get a feel for the dialogue system without explicitly being told that this is how it works. The final staircase leading up to the Asylum Demon splits two ways. On the right, players unlock their first shortcut. This is a pretty important moment. Progress can be hard to gauge in Dark Souls because completion is never explicitly indicated, and enemies continuously respawn. Discovering a new bonfire delivers a huge sense of accomplishment, but bonfires are intentionally limited in number. Shortcuts are a much better measure of progress due to how widely they're scattered across the entire game world. Dark Souls features a pretty punishing death system, but it's much more reasonable when you realize how easy it is to return to your bloodstain now that you've solved the areas leading up to it. Shortcuts reinforce this idea by permanently circumventing large sections of the game. Again, this is a philosophical and experiential idea more than a practical one, which is why I think they included a shortcut in the tutorial. It creates a feeling of progress that hints at how the player should approach the game proper. The left-hand side of the staircase extends and reinforces these experiential lessons. The player completes their metaphorical ascent and again learns the importance of tactical play. The archer is placed behind an easily exploitable wall, giving players time to take a step back and fight their opponents one-on-one. I also like the decision to save parrying for the very end. It's arguably one of the funnest aspects of this game's combat, but that's something players can realize on their own. The complexity of parrying means there's an upfront cost to learning it before players can do it properly, meaning novices ought to hold off until they understand the basics. The final encounter with the Asylum Demon is a nice contrast with the first one. As far as boss fights go, I'm not sure this was the best one to teach the game's basic controls. The Asylum Demon has a pretty weird hitbox, and that includes his weapon. I guess this is a general problem with Dark Souls, so I can't take too much of an issue with it here. I still wonder whether the Taurus Demon would have been a better choice. His weapon has the same hitbox problem, but at least his body is humanoid and easier to wrap your head around. This also would have prevented the reskin experience of the Asylum Demon later on during the trip to Izalith. After the player defeats the Asylum Demon, they watch a short cutscene showcasing Lordran before landing at Firelink Shrine. The Crows, Locked Door, and Stray Demon all indicate that the player can revisit the area later on. Beyond that, the tutorial is done. Dark Souls tutorial is really good. It gets all of the details right, and goes above and beyond what it needs to do. Its emphasis on the philosophical as well as the mechanical components of the game set up players for a much more successful playthrough. Like I mentioned earlier, tutorials are in some way a necessary evil, but Dark Souls doesn't think about it that way. It squeezes every ounce of value out of an otherwise short and uneventful sequence, a prelude to the way the developers approached the rest of the game. Alrighty, that's everything I had for today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you followed me here and on Twitter and Facebook to receive regular content updates. The relevant links are in the description below. All the best, and see you next time.